It has not been proven by science whether Adam and Eve were Ukrainians, although many Ukrainians believe so. It's a joke. But it has been proved for sure that primitive man appeared on the territory of Ukraine almost a million years ago, during the Paleolithic period. Around the 5th century BC, the Tripilia Cucutenia agricultural culture emerged. The largest European archaeological cultures of the Neolithic period, between 4th and early 3rd millennium BC, were the Tripilian and the Fenil culture. Even then, Ukrainians and Swedes maintain culture ties. Then, the Cimmerians, Scythians, Sarmatians, and Hellenic cities appeared on the Black Sea coast on the territory of Ukraine. At the beginning of our era, there were references to the Slavs as a settled people. During this period, the Great Migration of people took place, and many people passed through the territory of Ukraine, including the Germanic tribes of the Goths, Huns, and Turkic tribes. The Great Migration of peoples grew into Great Migration of Slavs, and the birth of the state of Rus. There is a Norman version of founding of the ruling dynasty in Rus, descended from the Jarl Rurik. Whether this is true or not is debated by scholars, but the fact that the Normans had a great cultural influence on the Rus is an indisputable fact. In 988, Prince Volodymyr of Kiev conducted a general baptism of the population of Rus. The adoption of Christianity as a state religion became one of the fundamental state-building vectors of the development of the Russian people. The so-called Kievan Rus existed as a federal state of Russian principalities until the middle of the 13th century, when it fell to the Mongol Tatar army. Later, the territory of present-day Ukraine belonged to several states: the Golden Horde, later the Crimean Khanate, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the Polish and Hungarian kingdoms, and these states were always fighting for Ukrainian lands. In 1385, the Union of Crete was signed, a union treaty that united two countries with Ukrainian lands, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland. In 1385, the Union of Lublin finally united Poland and Lithuania with Ukraine into one state, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. From that time on, religious and linguistic aggression by the Poles against Ukrainians began. This led to a series of uprisings and the Great War, led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky in 1648-1657. The main driver of these uprisings and the war was a social group of Cossack warriors. Cossacks lived throughout Ukraine Rus and gathered in the Zaporizhian siege military camp. The Cossacks were engaged in agriculture and merchanting in peacetime and willingly participated in European and Asian wars as mercenaries in various armies. However, the Cossacks considered their main military duty to be the defense of the territory of Ukraine from encroachments of neighboring countries. The Zaporizhian siege had full autonomy from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and later from the Moscow rulers, until it was destroyed by Muscovites in 1775. The Liberation War, led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky, continued with series of civil wars that led to the seizure of the part of the Ukrainian lands by the Moscow Empire. The autonomy of Ukrainian lands was increasingly lost. In 1709, Hetman of Ukraine, Ivan Mazepa, along with his Cossacks and the Cossacks of the Zaporizhian siege, supported the army of Swedish King Charles XII in the war against Moscow. But the allies were defeated near the city of Poltava and had to flee to Turkey. Ukraine Rus lost the chance to regain its statehood for nearly 200 years. Russian expansion continued to the south. The Crimean Tatar Khanate was conquered and ceased to exist as an independent country in 1783. Under the occupation of the Moscow state, Ukraine suffered from political oppression. The Cossack system and Magdeburg law in the cities were destroyed. The peasantry and the Cossacks were serfed, meaning that a peasant became the property of a nobleman. The language was deliberately and systematically banned and finally destroyed. But despite the active ethnocide, Ukrainian culture lives on and produces world-class heritage. This is the Aeneid, the first large-scale monument of Ukrainian literature, compiled in colloquial Ukrainian by Ivan Kotlяревський, published in 1798, a translation of Virgil Aeneid filled with Ukrainian culture and political context. Grigorій Savage Skovoroda was a Ukrainian mystical philosopher, theologian, poet, teacher, and possibly a composer of liturgical music. He had a significant impact on his contemporaries and subsequent generations with his fables, songs, philosophical works, and lifestyle, which is why he was called Socrates. Taras Shevchenko was a Ukrainian poet, prose writer, thinker, painter, engraver, ethnographer, and public figure. National hero and symbol of Ukraine, a figure of the Ukrainian national movement, author of the poetry collection Kobzar. Such figures as writers Іван Франко, Леся Українка, Панас Мирний, Іван Коцюбинський, Ольга Кобилянська, Іван Нечуй-Левицький, playwright and theater worker Marko Kropivnicki, composers Микола Лисенко, Микола Леонтович, and many others created Ukrainian culture under occupation. Their ideas shaped the worldview of many generations in Ukraine. For the current generation, these figures have become symbols of the unbreakable will to freedom. The picture shows graffiti from the Maidan of 2013-2014. The lands of Ukraine were divided between Russia and Austria-Hungary. In 1914, the First World War broke out and Ukrainians found themselves fighting in the warring armies. In 1917, a political crisis occurred in Russia and Ukrainians proclaimed the Ukrainian People's Republic. On January 22, 1919, the Act of Unification of the Ukrainian People's Republic and the Western Ukrainian People's Republic was proclaimed. In a fierce struggle against Bolshevik Russia, so-called the Liberation War, in 1920, Ukraine lost its independence and was divided between Russia and Poland. For several years, uprisings against the Bolsheviks continued on the territory of Ukraine, and the struggle was not equal. From 1932 to 1934, the genocide of Ukrainians through famine took place in Ukraine, a tragedy called the Holodomor. All food stocks and seed grain were forcibly confiscated from peasant households. The fact that number of victims varied from region to region indicates that this famine was artificial and that no drought could have led to such a high death toll. Another aggravating factor was the fact that peasants in the USSR did not have passports and were not allowed to leave their villages. It is important to note that at the same time, the so-called Great Terror began in the Soviet Union, a large-scale organization of a system of extermination and imprisonment of its citizens on political grounds. In Ukraine, this terror was also directed against intellectuals and was called the Executed Renaissance. Several hundreds Ukrainian artists and scientists were repressed by the authorities, shot and sentenced to many years in prison as enemies of the people. This process was one of the fundamental elements of the ethnocide, the extermination of Ukrainians as a nation. One of the components of this crime was policy of brain migration. More or less, literature people were lured out of Ukraine in various ways, and technical and humanitarian intellectuals were brought to Ukraine, while Russian-speaking specialists were important instead. The Soviet Union persistently continued its imperial policy of Russification of Ukrainians, which began when the first territories of Ukraine came under Moscow's rule. It seems that Ukrainians do not offer any resistance, but a movement is emerging in emigrant circles that aims to liberate Ukraine and restore its statehood. In 1929, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, was founded in Vienna. OUN cells began operating in Ukrainian territories under Polish occupation. They educated the local population, trained young people, and prepared terrorist acts against Polish statesmen. The OUN members recognized that terror against Polish officials was relevant to the policy of Polonization, which was systematically pursued by the Polish government. An outstanding terrorist attack was the murder of Soviet diplomat and intelligence officer Milo in Lviv. OUN activists declared this murder an act of protest against the Holodomor genocide in Soviet Ukraine. Against the backdrop of this struggle, a new political figure, Stepan Bandera, was emerging, who would later lead the liberation movement in Ukraine. Bandera was one of the main ideologues of the struggle for Ukrainian independence in the first half of the 20th century, a symbol of the national liberation movement. In June 1941, the leadership of the OUN wing proclaimed the Ukrainian state in Lviv. But as Nazi Germany denied Ukraine's independence, Bandera was arrested and spent 3 years in German prisons and camps. With the approach of Soviet troops in 1944, Bandera once again led the OUN and remained its leader until his last days. He was assassinated in Munich by Soviet special services. The name of Stepan Bandera still terrifies Ukraine's enemies. That is why Soviet and later Russian historiography deliberately falsified facts about his life and activities. On September 1, 1939, the Second World War began, and Germany attacked Poland. 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union also attacks Poland, and Ukrainian territories are redistributed. In 1941, Germany attacks the USSR. The war spreads in a bloody wave across Ukraine. In 1944, Soviet troops enter the territory of Ukraine and push the Germans back to the borders of 1941. In June 1941, the leadership of the OUN wing, led by Bandera, proclaimed Ukrainian state in Lviv, but the Germans were against the restoration of Ukrainian statehood. Many Ukrainian nationalists were arrested and killed. Stepan Bandera was arrested and held in a concentration camp until 1944. The OUN goes underground and spreads its activities throughout Ukraine. In 1942, the Ukrainian insurgent army was founded under the leadership of Roman Shukhevich to regain Ukraine's independence and fought on 2 fronts against the German and Soviet invaders. The UPA actively resisted the Bolsheviks until 1954. The activities of the OUN and UPA are persistently falsified by Soviet propaganda. The leaders of this organization are accused of collaborating with the political leadership of Nazi Germany and of numerous crimes against the civilian population. They were accused of propagating Nazi ideology. However, one of the goals of the UNUPA was the liberation of the enslaved peoples by the Soviet Union. Freedom to the peoples, freedom to the people was the slogan of the UNUPA. Ukrainians continue to fight tirelessly for Ukraine's independence. An entire generation of so-called cities named after the years of their resistance, scholars, artists, human rights activists, and ordinary people tried to resist the totalitarian communist regime through public statements and protest. Most of them were repressed and suffered political oppression. Some paid with their lives, such as the poet Vasyl Simonenko and the artist Alla Horska. In 1976, the Ukrainian Helsinki Group was founded, a powerful human rights community whose founders were arrested and convicted a year later. The struggle continued until the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Soviet Union entered a desperate political and economic crisis, and Ukraine formally gained independence. State building began, but Moscow's influence and the nostalgia of some Ukrainians for the Soviet Union greatly hampered the development of the young democracy. The protest of an active part of Ukrainians against pro-Moscow governments grew. Thus, in 2004, the Orange Revolution took place, a massive, peaceful, nationwide protest against fraud in the presidential election in Ukraine, which resulted in the coming to power of the pro-European President Viktor Yushchenko. At the end of 2013, the Revolution of Dignity began, when Ukrainians opposed the policies of pro-Moscow President Viktor Yanukovych. The peaceful protest escalated into violent confrontation between activists and law enforcement officials. The confrontation spread from the capital to the rest of the country. Kyiv Main Square, Майдан Незалежності, became the center of events. The revolution culminated in the mass shooting of unarmed protesters by police on Institutska Street on February 20, 2014. That did not stop the protesters, and Yanukovych fled to Russia. The Verkhovna Rada dismissed the pro-Moscow government. Instead, Russia launched a war against Ukraine by occupying the Crimean Republic in February 2014. In March 2014, Russian special services inspired anti-governmental uprisings in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Moscow agents, with the assistance of local traitors, seized state institutions. In violation of the Constitution of Ukraine, People's Republic were proclaimed. The Ukrainian government attempted to stabilize the situation and entered into a military confrontation with illegal military formation organized by Russian special services and Russian military units. In fact, parts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions were occupied by Russia. The confrontation of varying degrees of intensity continued until the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russian troops on February 24, 2022. The armed force of Ukraine, with the support of Ukrainian people, repelled the Moscow invaders. The Russian Federation held illegal referendums in the occupied territories and announced the accession of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Lugansk regions to its federation. Currently, hostilities continue on the territory of Ukraine. The joint defense forces, with the help of weapons and ammunition from Western countries, are holding the line. Ukraine has also received unconditional political support from the countries of the free democratic world, including Sweden.